Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Devil's Advocate. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Kevin Yam to join our program. Kevin is originally from Hong Kong and is currently a PhD candidate at Melbourne Law School at Melbourne University, right?
Yes, and I do a little bit of part-time lecturing there too, yeah.
Kevin is famously one of the two Australian resident, ex-Hong Kong resident being wanted by the Hong Kong government. You have a bounty on your head. It's a million Hong Kong dollars, isn't it?
Yeah, it's $1 million Hong Kong dollars. It's on current exchange rates. It's around 190,000 Australian dollars. Yeah.
Tell me, how do I get to claim that bounty? Do I just give them your address, email address, or what? Yeah.
I think you can just, well, I think you've got to do better than that. You've got to be able to kidnap me back to Hong Kong or to the consulate or something like that, I suspect.
So tell me, what's the status of the extradition arrangement between Hong Kong and Australia? It's been suspended, is it?
That's right. It's been suspended, and there are no indications that it will be revived anytime soon.
So technically speaking, if the treaty hasn't been suspended, Australian government has to put you in jail and awaiting extradition, right? They have to comply with the treaty.
Potentially. I mean, there are complications always around these sorts of issues, but that's one possibility.
So presumably, from my understanding, is that the Australian government has to be satisfied that what you were charged with in Hong Kong is also a crime in Australia, right?
There's that, but I mean, the reality is that it's already been suspended, and I mean, I don't think there's much utility in reopening that whole can of worms, and it's really more about ensuring that it doesn't get revived.
So let's go to the main topic of today's discussion, the trial of Jimmy Lai and Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement and the future of Hong Kong's freedom. Can you explain to us the charges against Jimmy Lai and what evidence were presented?
To cut a very long story short, he was charged with colluding with foreign forces, or they call them external forces, under the national security law, as well as for publishing seditious publications through his Apple Daily newspaper. And the allegation, essentially, he went around to the United States and so on to advocate for consequences, including sanctions, against Hong Kong officials and Chinese officials for the way they were and still are eroding Hong Kong's autonomy and human rights. And they claim that that's a crime under the national security law. And they tried to adduce evidence about all the meetings he had in the US, all the various online interviews he did, all the various articles that Apple Daily had published. And they ended up writing a judgment that ran into hundreds of pages, which was just about all of these things, and then say, oh, that's guilty.
Let's say, pretend you were the magistrate overseeing the case. Technically, according to the letters of the law, of the national security law, were Jimmy Lai actually guilty? Technically, according to the actual law?
Well, it's hard to say, because actually the law itself was quite broadly and vaguely drafted, right? Yeah. And also it sought to override Hong Kong's own basic law with various guarantees of fundamental rights. So in a way, it's a little bit meaningless to go into this sort of hypothetical exercise of, was he or wasn't he guilty of this in the first place? I mean, let's remember in the first place that the national security law was not a piece of Hong Kong legislation. It was actually imposed directly by Beijing. Okay?
Which is against the spirit of the basic law or the agreement between China and Britain.
That's right. It's totally against the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It's against the basic law. You know, when it comes to things like this, it shouldn't have happened in the first place. And so to go on and try and make sense and to say, oh, let's go through a technical analysis of all of this is in a way a little bit meaningless.
Basically, the definition of collusion is very vague, right, in the law. So it can be described as anything talking with foreign officials or advocating for sanctions, even though it's in any normal reading of the common law or freedom of speech definition, it falls into the category of free speech. But the prosecutors or the Chinese authority can basically use the clause of collusion to include anything, any speech.
Well, perhaps I can use an Australian example. Okay, I mean, given that you and I are both in Australia, think back to, say, the 1970s and 1980s when LGBTQ activists in Australia back then used to go to the United Nations a lot and criticize Australia's then position on LGBTQ rights. Okay, and they were calling for consequences for Australia. They were calling for international pressure to change Australia's policy in those areas. Now, imagine if Australia had laws like what is now Hong Kong's national security law, and if it was applied in the way that we saw in Jimmy Lai's case in relation to so-called collusion with external forces, then actually those gay activists in Australia back in the 70s and 1980s would have been found guilty, right? And I use this as an example because a lot of this work of international lobbying relating to shortcomings in one's home country is actually quite common in democracies and in places that respect human rights. Whereas in China and now in Hong Kong, it's now considered a crime.
So let's talk about the specific tensions being shown in Jimmy Lai's case. First, as you mentioned, is judicial independence. Normally in Hong Kong's trial, you use a jury system, right?
It's a bit complicated in Hong Kong, partly as a matter of its colonial legacy when it was hard to find sufficient numbers of the local Chinese population that had, fluent English to do what used to be, and in some cases in Hong Kong, even now, English language trials. In Hong Kong, it was only the most serious crimes that were in Hong Kong, they call it the High Court. In Australia, they would call it the Supreme Court level. It's only sort of cases like rape, homicide, and so on that would be heard in these, highest trial courts that would have jury trials. Now, what is of particular relevance with the national security law is that it seeks to displace the right to a jury trial where it once existed. So yes, okay, for sure, Hong Kong didn't have the full suite of jury trial rights like we'll see in the UK or in Australia, but in more serious cases, there were jury trials, and the national security law allowed judges and allowed the Secretary for Justice to displace that. Further, in usual court trials, the court allocates a judge. Obviously, there's some specialization involved. They would try and allocate a judge with some criminal law expertise to hear a criminal case and so on. But in the case of national security prosecutions, only judges that have been approved by Hong Kong's chief executive can hear these trials. So they're in effect handpicked by the government. So you can imagine a situation where your jury trial has been abrogated for a case of the alleged seriousness of Lai's case. And then you have judges have been handpicked by the government. So it's all very well to say that, the judges are hearing evidence and are deciding the cases without anyone tapping them on their shoulders to say how they must rule. But if they've been handpicked by the government on the belief that they're more likely than not to go in a particular direction, then that's already a compromising of judicial independence in itself.
What was the reason or the excuses given by the Hong Kong authorities for opting out of the jury trial? Is that for just national security concern or secrecy required?
yeah, they say that it's a national security issue, and they feel that these are the sorts of issues that shouldn't go to a jury unless we say so, so that we think that it's okay to go to a jury. And to date, we have not seen a single trial where they've allowed a jury.
The second tension, of course, as we discussed, is the freedom of speech versus subversion. So how do the prosecution square this circle about seditious articles and speech for inciting violence versus the free expression guaranteed in the one country, two system framework?
I don't think they've tried, and I don't think they try very hard. So if we go right back to the early days after the handover, when Hong Kong government itself tried to impose national security law of sorts in Hong Kong, and it was met with a lot of resistance, and in fact, the Hong Kong government had to pull back from legislating those things back in 2003. Now, during the consultation for those earlier national security laws back then, the Hong Kong government back then actually conceded that things like sedition would fall foul of the Basic Law and of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which is embedded in the Basic Law as well. But after the national security law came into effect, the Hong Kong government saw fit to bring back the use of sedition as a way to prosecute people, not just Jimmy Lai, but others too. And the Hong Kong courts have been quick to just say, oh, sedition laws are constitutional, even though there's been other case law in other parts of the common law world that says that sedition laws are now largely contrary to freedom of expression guarantees in human rights documents.
Doesn't the tension show the inherent contradiction of the one country, two system framework? Because the whole concept is a contradiction in itself, right? If you have one country, in the end, you can't have two systems, because there has to be, from Beijing's point of view, there has to be the overriding high authority from Beijing, which override everything in Hong Kong. So you can say this whole framework is never going to work, is it?
The idea of one country, two systems per se is not necessarily doomed to failure, because actually, in a way, if one thinks about it, I know that people like Deng Xiaoping used to say, oh, we've created this whole idea that's never been seen before in history and so on. But think about it. Canada, right? I mean, Quebec, which operates on a fairly different legal system. They use European continental law as opposed to common law in other parts of Canada. There's a form of one country, two systems there.
So it's like a quasi half independent province.
Well, not quite, but it's definitely a different type of legal system. I mean, even in the United Kingdom itself, once you cross the border into Scotland, Scottish law is based on Roman law, which is different from common law south of the border. So the concept of one country, two systems isn't necessarily doomed to failure per se. The reason why in the China context, unfortunately, it was probably, in retrospect, doomed to failure, is that we've got an authoritarian wanting to assert the one country and an authoritarian wanting to have the final say about what they think is or isn't two systems. And so the conflict is essentially between authoritarianism and liberalism, rather than one country, two systems per se.
What I mean with the inherent contradiction is that, well, the Chinese constitution, of course, is the supreme law of the land. And in the constitution itself, it says, well, the Communist Party leadership is, you can't challenge that. That's the ultimate authority in China. So that's what I'm saying is the inherent contradiction, right? Even if you have two systems, a second system in Hong Kong, but based on the Chinese constitution, you are not allowed to speak against the supreme authority of the Chinese Communist Party, and that's exactly what the demonstrators, the protesters, has been doing in the last 20 years, right? So it's doomed to fail. That's what I mean.
But the thing is that the Chinese Constitution also had a specific article, Article 31, which said that
free speech.
China can create special administrative regions with different systems, with different laws, with different standards, right? So in a way, China that has now breached its own constitution insofar as the operation of special administrative regions are concerned. So this isn't one of those semi-autonomous regions that's created in other parts of China. Hong Kong and Macau are created as special administrative regions under a very specific article within the Chinese Constitution. So if we want to get sort of fairly legalistic about it, actually by trying to impose what you've mentioned in relation to the Chinese Constitution being a people's dictatorship in a Marxist-Leninist setting and trying to impose those sorts of values on Hong Kong, that's actually a breach of the Chinese Constitution itself.
And also, yeah, if we get into the constitutional detail, there is also a clause in the Chinese Constitution that guarantees the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So that clause is also contradicts with the supreme authority of the Communist Party, right? So basically, I guess China doesn't have a constitutional court, so there's no one except the Communist Party or the party-led National People's Congress Standing Committee to explain to judiciate the differences in the different clauses of the Constitution.
That's right. And the idea of interpreting the Chinese Constitution, or in fact, even interpreting the basic law, the ultimate authority lies with the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, which is different to the idea that those of us who are used to more, for want of a better term, Western legal systems where we're used to fundamental documents being interpreted by courts, or even if it's not by courts, it's by a specially convened council of some sort, which carries certain independence and authority. That's not the case here. I mean, the National People's Congress and its members and the Standing Committee are very much creatures of the party.
Jimmy Lai's 20-year sentence is the toughest allowed under the national security law, right? Well, the Hong Kong government calls it justice because he endangered Hong Kong's stability and security. So how did the Hong Kong government differentiate real threats against Hong Kong's national security with ordinary common dissent?
They don't really. First of all, the maximum sentence allowed under the national security law for Jimmy Lai is actually life in prison. So they've given him 20 years. And in a way, they're playing with words, because you give a 78-year-old man a 20-year prison rather than a life sentence. It's actually the same as a life sentence in practice, right? Especially in circumstances where under further national security legislation in Hong Kong, it's said that in national security cases, it's virtually impossible to get early release on parole. Okay, so the 20 years actually has to be served in full. So there's that. And then as for what's real threats versus ordinary dissent, I don't think the Hong Kong government really distinguishes that anymore. And to illustrate the point, all we need to do is to look at what happened late last year when 7 buildings in a Hong Kong apartment complex had catastrophic fires that killed over 160 people. And criticisms of the way officials handled that fire, the way policy was run leading up to the fire itself, that enabled a lot of corruption in construction contracts and building maintenance contracts and so on. Even those sorts of criticisms were labeled by the Hong Kong government and by the Chinese government as attempts to undermine Hong Kong's national security, okay, and China's national security. So when you've got something that's not even quote unquote political, it was just a catastrophe where, a little bit like what happened with Grenfell Tower in London some years ago, the residents and ordinary people were calling for accountability for such a catastrophic fire. In Britain, they held independent inquiries and there was some accountability. In Hong Kong and China, they're now saying that going around calling for that is in itself a national security threat.
How exactly is the situation at the moment in Hong Kong, the press freedom? Are people still allowed to express any dissent of any kind in the media?
I think the proof of the cake is in the pudding. Hong Kong was ranked like in the high teens, low 20s, global press freedom indices back in the early 2000s. It is now ranked in the mid 100s, right? So yeah, it's still better than China, no doubt, but think of how far Hong Kong has fallen. We're seeing a situation where public broadcaster RTHK has now been neutered and has become essentially state media. Other privately owned media, there's a lot of self-censorship going on right now. Independent media that refuse to self-censor entirely are subject to various forms of harassment. We have seen cases where that's been publicized, where independent media have been subject to tax audits and spurious tax claims and so on. And that's the environment in which the media operates in Hong Kong now. So it's actually, they've stifled protests with the national security law, but they've also stifled accountability through the fourth estate, the media, by using all sorts of administrative and other means to put pressure on them.
What do you think is the likelihood that Trump can make a deal in his coming visit to Beijing next in April? In April? Is it there is a likelihood that if he can strike a deal to get Beijing to release Jimmy Lai on humanitarian ground?
Who knows? When it comes to international diplomacy, it's hard to guess. I'm not particularly optimistic, simply because Jimmy Lai is considered almost like enemy number one by the Chinese authorities. And if we think of another very well-known Chinese dissident where there were attempts to negotiate early release and exile overseas for him, if we think of someone like Liu Xiaobo, because he was considered like China's enemy number one at the time when he was in prison, despite all the efforts of Western governments, that didn't work. Now, of course, the difference is that Jimmy Lai is a British citizen. Not that I expect Britain to be doing very much for him, but it might be that in a set of United States-led negotiations with Britain formally leading it because Jimmy Lai is a British citizen, they might say, okay, we'll let Jimmy Lai serve the rest of his sentence in Britain and then let him go to Britain. But I'm not holding my breath for that to happen.
If I were an advisor to the Chinese Foreign Ministry or to the White House, I would suggest Jimmy Lai's case is a good case to make a deal because he's already 78. His business empire has been decimated, basically. So he will no longer have any concrete influence on the being an actual enemy against the Chinese state. So by striking a deal to release him on humanitarian ground, Beijing can solve a PR problem and Donald Trump can get a PR victory. And so it's a win-win situation for China and the United States. So it just like what happened before with the Tiananmen leaders. China did release quite a few of them into the United States.
But I guess the difference is that the China that was willing to release Tiananmen leaders all those years ago is not the China that we know today. The China we know today, especially under Trump, is feeling emboldened because a lot of America's traditional allies are seeing China as a bit of a backup now. And so the risk is there is actually less incentive for China to give ground now on things like this. But that said, I wouldn't lose hope altogether. You never know what happens behind the scenes. And let's see how it all goes.
One of the key claims made by Beijing and its propaganda workers in the Western social media is that the Hong Kong protest was very violent. Well, we did see some video footage, or some violent incidents, which is unfortunate, and there are some violent attack on police. Let's compare that with the J6 riot in Washington, D.C. If the United States can charge those rioters at Capitol Hill, why can't the Hong Kong authority charge those people involved in violent protests in Hong Kong?
I guess the difference is one of context. Okay, so if we look at January 6th in the United States, that was very much a movement to subvert a democratic election. What happened in 2009 was actually a culmination of decades of broken promises, where every other avenue of peaceful campaigning, of lobbying for a more democratic future. I mean, let's not forget that in the late 2000s, we actually had the pro-democracy camp in Hong Kong negotiating directly with Beijing on a timetable for direct elections for the chief executive and for all of the legislative council, and there was some movement towards that at the time. Beijing subsequently broke those promises, and then that led to the 2014 umbrella movement, which was peaceful. That went nowhere. Then, in fact, Beijing started pressing on the pro-democracy camp and started to disqualify pro-democracy legislators during the mid-2010s. And even then, Hong Kong people were still quietly, peacefully campaigning for more democracy. And it was only when China and Hong Kong were brazen enough to try and breach the legal wall between Hong Kong and China by introducing an extradition law that enabled easy extradition to China, that was the last straw that broke the camel's back. That's when Hong Kong people realized that all the things that were done in peaceful ways to promote democracy and so on went nowhere. And the other thing, of course, to remember, and I'm not seeking to justify violence per se, is that actually, if we look at the violence that went on during the 2019 protest movement, a lot of it was very much targeted at the pro-Beijing forces, essentially, in Hong Kong. And there was quite a lot of care generally in trying to avoid harming ordinary people and businesses. And I don't think the same can be said for the J6 riot. So to compare the Hong Kong movement, which was a last straw in fighting for democracy and fighting back against the rising tide of authoritarianism, versus January 6th in the US, which was an attempt to subvert democracy itself, I don't think one can compare the two in any coherent way at all.
Were those protesters who engaged in violence, were they charged and jailed? Because most of the high-profile cases we know are the so-called leaders who were not involved in actual violence, but rather than incitement.
Well, actually, they couldn't really find evidence of incitement by so-called pro-democracy leaders in relation to, the violence in Hong Kong, because the reality was that by 2019, even people like Jimmy Lai and people like Joshua Wong were considered a little bit old hat, and that the frontline protesters didn't really listen to them anyway. If we look at frontline protesters and so on, a lot of them have been charged with illegal assembly, riot, possessing offensive weapons and so on, and a lot of them have been jailed. So that's unfortunate too, because we're talking about largely well-educated youths who have seen the freedoms that their parents had been guaranteed being eaten away, and that years of peaceful advocacy had gone nowhere. So in fact, that also explains why for years Hong Kong mainstream had been very much against any hint of violence in the democracy movement. very much against it. Why was it that in the 2019 protests, even peacefully protesting Hong Kongers were largely supportive of the more violent protesters? It's precisely because they've done the peaceful stuff for decades and saw that it went nowhere. So I think the context is very different.
Let's talk about the case of Anna Kwok's father, which from surface reading the charges, quite ridiculous, right? So basically, her father was charged with withdrawing the reinsurance payout. Was it actually transmitted to her, or?
No. So basically, it's like, Han, you would understand. I mean, a lot of Asian parents like buying these so-called sort of education or investment-based policies so their kids, when they're babies, on the understanding that, maybe when they grow up, and what if by then I couldn't afford to send them to university, then they can have this sum of money to go and study. It's that sort of thing, right? So the money was actually her father's. It got to the point where Anna Kwok's grown up and she's in the situation that she's in. And it's pretty natural that, the father probably thought, I'm not privy to all the thinking processes, but it wouldn't surprise me, typical Asian parents, which I'm sure, you and I both are, thinking, hey, if my children couldn't make use of this sum of money that I've reserved for them, then maybe I can use it for myself. It's his money. It might be in her name technically, but
the money is technically in his trust, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, technically, Anna Kwok's the beneficiary of the insurance policy, but the money was put in by him, and Anna Kwok never put in any of the money, right? And so you're talking about a situation where the father was essentially saying, hey, if my daughter couldn't use the money, then I want it back. So and he's convicted for that. But let's go back one step with all of this, right? And that is all of these sorts of laws saying, we wouldn't even let a father do this. It's essentially to try and pressure Anna Kwok into silence. Let there be no doubt, right? And it's also to try and cut Anna Kwok from her family, right? It's like this Chinese phrase, right? 断六亲, right? Breaking the links of 6 degrees of family links, right? And that's what they're trying to do to dissidents around the world. Harass family members back home, not just to try and silence them overseas, but to try and deprive them of family connection.
So I guess this is the equivalent of, say, in the United States, when the government tried to charge the mafia boss, they can't find any real evidence of crime, so they charge them with tax evasion on a technicality. So this is probably in nature, it's the same thing, right? Because the Hong Kong's authorities' aim is to pressure Anna Kwok herself, and then so they're trying to use any technicality to achieve this means.
Yeah, except in the United States, if they're going to charge the mafia with tax evasion, they're charging the actual mafia people, right? Mm-hmm. Then here they're going after family members who are not in the game, so to speak, right? So that's the difference. This idea of going after family is actually the worst and lowest form of transnational repression. I mean, just think of typical organized crime and stories about them that you hear reported in the news. Even in organized crime, unless you're talking about family members that are in the business itself, otherwise they generally don't go after non-participating family members because they don't want to see revenge against their own family, right? The Hong Kong authorities are now doing what even the mafia isn't doing, so essentially.
Beijing supporters say, well, the national security law's vague terms are flexible tools to combat real separatism threats, just like, say, in the United States or in Australia, the anti-terrorism laws, very broad applications to combat terrorism threat. What's your response to those comparisons?
Well, those comparisons are wrong because we have a situation where in Western countries, they're subject to a lot of fairly stringent procedural and human rights safeguards.
Due process.
Not just due process, but also rules of statutory construction the right of interpretation of these laws lie ultimately with the courts. Here, with the national security law, what we've seen is that when the courts potentially Hong Kong courts potentially wanted to go in a different direction, the National People's Congress would step in and reinterpret provisions of national security law in the way that they want to see it interpreted. And so the courts have to follow, and the courts know that they can't touch on some of Beijing's red lines, which are always moving. In fact, one of Hong Kong's former non-permanent justices on the Court of Final Appeal, Lord Sumption of Britain, in a different podcast, said to an interviewer that he spoke with a Hong Kong Court of Appeal judge who said that, hey, we can't fight against Beijing on things like this, because even if we interpreted the national security law in a certain way, they in Beijing can override us anyway. So it's a very different environment. The substantive safeguards are very different. There's trial by jury in Australia as well. So for Beijing to just superficially take some wording and say, oh, it's not that different, I think that's disingenuous.
In America, there were recent widespread protests against ICE law enforcement, and the Trump administration, the senior officials from Trump to the vice president to the Secretary of Homeland Security, all branded the two victims of ICE agents as domestic terrorists. And many China supporters would point out the hypocrisy of the US administration. On the one hand, they are attacking their own American protesters as terrorists. On the other hand, they are accusing Hong Kong to suppress peaceful protests. What do you say to that?
My response is simple. Two wrongs do not make a right. I don't think I need to say more than that. That's the simplest logic to all of this.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you, because we are both on the left side of politics here, and I think we are the consistent one, right? We are both critical of China's human rights abuses and America's human rights abuses. Unlike the many right-wing commentators here, they were singly focused on China's abuses, but they were quite silent on the current Trump administration's human rights abuses.
Well, I guess it's a reflection of the very polarized world in which we live now, right? I mean, we see that not just with China-related issues. We see that with, say, Iran as well. You know, it really ought not be a left-right issue, but somehow it's become a left-right issue in the West.
You know, Australia has just passed what they call the anti-hate speech laws. The coalition, the conservative sector among the coalition parties are fiercely against the law. And don't you think they have some valid points in their opposition, because the law basically criminalized a lot of speech, right?
I don't necessarily disagree with them on some of their concerns. And I also look at this sort of legislation in terms of be careful what you wish for. I perfectly understand the desire to stop the spread of hate, especially to deal with the scourge of anti-Semitism. However, what we need to be very careful about when it comes to laws like this is that we do not set a precedent for those who are against everything that we believe in. They might one day come to power and cite you as a precedent and say, we're now going to ban you instead. And that's not what we want to see. So we need to be careful about what sorts of precedents we are setting with laws like this.
For example, the conservatives here in Australia, many of them are calling for banning the phrase, not even the conservative, even I think New South Wales government minister agree. They want to ban the phrase globalized intifada. How do you actually enforce that? And will that survive a challenge in a court in the end? I mean, can it be justified, the free speech ground, to use the phrase globalized intifada or free Palestine from river to the sea? Can you?
Okay, Australia's laws and doctrines in relation to freedom of expression are a little bit more narrow than other parts of the Western world. The Australian Constitution does not have a constitutionally entrenched set of fundamental rights in it, like many other parts of the Western world.
Yeah, it's implied
but
here,
there
right?
but there is case law that says that because Parliament has to be chosen by the people under the Australian Constitution, there is an implied freedom of, they don't call it freedom of expression, they call it a freedom of political communication. And it will be interesting to see, and my understanding is that there are challenges afoot to these laws to see whether the Australian court would say that such laws would infringe the implied freedom of political communication in Australia. But let's remember that that sort of Australian doctrine is probably a little bit narrower in application than the way we would understand freedom of expression in Europe and the United States in their case law.
Let's say you are a parliament member sitting in the parliament. Would you vote to criminalize globalized intifada speech?
Look, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals like this because I'm not a member of parliament and I never will be. All I can say is that if you're going to just criminalize a particular phrase, that's always something that needs to be scrutinized very closely, instead of trying to legislate to look at whether there's specific incitement to racism or violence or hate. So I would have a lot of concerns about banning particular phrases as words themselves as opposed to the context in which they're uttered. I mean, there's no doubt that in some contexts, globalize the Intifada is a call for hate against Jewish people. But I think let's look at context rather than words. That would be my preference. But I'm not going to get into a hypothetical about what I would do about, as a parliamentarian, because I'm not and never will be.
I think perhaps the U.S. constitutional doctrine or the doctrine adopted by the Supreme Court of the imminent incitement of actual violence, probably that's a good test, right? So the slogan itself, unless you can prove that the slogan itself incite actual violence, imminent violence against actual victims, then you can justify that as a criminal speech. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to prove in court.
Well, again, I would have to note that the Australian doctrine of implied freedom of political communication is a narrower doctrine than the United States First Amendment related legal doctrines. And it remains to be seen how far our courts will go in contexts like this, because the implied freedom for political communication I shouldn't say created, is found by the court as being something that facilitates a free and informed casting of votes in elections. So let's see how far the court takes that idea. But I would be surprised if they take the idea as far as the United States or the European Court of Human Rights would, because they operate under very different human rights guarantee provisions.
With Trump's America First doctrine, many of his supporters are saying the United States should focus on domestic issues, and when dealing with China, they should focus on America's national interest. So not to prioritize sanctions. So, for example, the Magnitsky type of sanctions against China, because they have more pressing issues to deal with, like trade deficit. Donald Trump is desperate to reach a trade deal with China. So what do you say to those people?
Everything is related, right? The United States' economic prosperity and economic dominance after World War II was underpinned by not just its own sort of big market, but it's also underpinned by the fact that it had a strong military, it had strong enforcement of international rules, and also strength around the Western Pacific. So the United States ruled the seas, right? Now, if the United States decide now to be completely isolationist and that we're just going to worry about the bottom line on the trade deficit, that would come back to bite the United States economically eventually, because if authoritarian states like China, like Russia, are not contained both economically and politically and militarily, then once they break through, I mean, just think about, what if China breaks through in Taiwan? Then that's a gaping big hole right in the middle of the Western Pacific, and China has naval access all the way through. And if we think about things like access to South China Sea, to Taiwan Straits, to parts of the Pacific, which are major shipping routes from a global trade perspective, an isolationist United States will find that it will eventually suffer from their own trading routes being cut off by assertive authoritarians if they don't hold the line.
Early in January, the United States conducted a military action against Venezuelan President Maduro, and basically with the excuse of law enforcement. Of course, the actual rationale is more related to national security ground. So my question is, if the United States is entitled to use military power, coercive power, or to basically kidnap a foreign leader for its national security considerations, isn't China, the second superpower, also entitled to pursue its own national interest by pursuing those people they see a national security threat abroad?
It is an unfortunate part of the post-war international legal order that from time to time we have seen superpowers, whether it's the United States or in the past the Soviet Union and now China and to an extent Russia, breaking the very principles that they have created themselves. And that's unfortunate, and let there be no doubt. The question therefore is, it's happened. Is anything good going to come out of it? And I think it's too early to tell. And unfortunately, the early signs are not good. The reality with the Venezuelan situation is that if by doing a wrong thing, it turned out that the Venezuelan people were going to get free and fair elections and a democratic government and so on, then okay, it's a wrong thing to do, but maybe there's a silver lining to it. But at the moment, it's hard to see where that silver lining is with Trump keeping Maduro's hench people in power and all of that. So watch this space, I guess.
What's your assessment of the current Australian Labor government's strategy towards China? On the one hand, they have significantly softened their rhetoric against China compared to the previous Conservative government. But on the other hand, the Albanese government has continued the hardline military strategy of continuing on the AUKUS procurement, which China is vehemently against. How do you assess the strategy? Is this like two-hands strategy?
It's a strategy that the perception of what that strategy looks like has probably changed a lot in the past year or two. So I don't think Australian foreign and defense policy has actually changed in the last year or two. So as you have rightly said, on the one hand, they have softened their rhetoric on China significantly. Although to be fair to the Australian government, when the Chinese government tried to intimidate me and Ted Hui with leaflet drops around Adelaide and Melbourne asking us to be kidnapped back to Hong Kong, the Australian government did come out and say that the Chinese are behaving reprehensibly. And then on the other hand, as you say, they're keeping AUKUS. Not only that, they're also competing with China in terms of Pacific security. They are seeking to take Darwin ports back. And recently, they've also imposed punitive tariffs on Chinese steel frames after an investigation by Australia found that Chinese steel frames are being dumped in Australia on heavy Chinese government subsidies. So that's been a consistent strategy by the Australian government for a year or two now, well, actually even 2 or 3 years. 2 or 3 years ago, if you compare that sort of strategy with the rest of the Western world, you would probably say, oh, Australia was relatively soft on China. But in the last year, with Trump having come to power and all the other Western countries, especially Canada, Britain, and parts of Europe having recalibrated their China approach, Australia hasn't changed, but now you can say that Australia is probably one of the harder line countries in the West when it comes to dealing with China. All of this not due to Australia changing its approach, but due to its allies having changed its approach post-Trump.
As a Hong Kong democracy activist, do you support more hardline measures against China? Considering China is Australia's biggest trading partner, a lot of Australians' livelihood depend on trading with China. So what's your suggestion for the Australian government? What do you want them to do to help your cause, but also in the meantime preserving the economic opportunities for ordinary Australian?
I actually think the Hong Kong cause and Australia's economic interests are completely aligned. Let's not forget here that we're not dealing with the China of 10, 15 years ago when it was a rising, booming economy. We are dealing now with a China that is going through structural economic downturn as the excesses of previous decades are now coming home to roost. The property sector in Hong Kong, not in Hong Kong, sorry, but in China is falling through the floor. There's enough empty housing there for China to double its population, and it still wouldn't fill all of that housing that's been built. There's got to be question marks about how much longer China can sustain things like iron ore purchases from Australian producers when its industrial and its property sectors are in structural decline. And that's even before mentioning the demographic crunch that China is starting to face because they've stopped the one-child policy a little bit too late. So, in fact, what we're seeing in China now is kind of where Japan was in the early 1990s, but at a stage when China is still relatively poor, whereas Japan was already very rich by the early 1990s. And China's decline is kind of on steroids compared with the slow implosion that Japan has gone through since the early 1990s. So why am I talking about all of this? It is the reality that even if we do not care about human rights, even if we do not care about sovereignty, even if we do not care about defense, purely as a matter of economics and trade, Australia needs to start looking for alternatives to China now, because China's not going to have the money to buy Australian goods for all that much longer. I mean, Australia traditionally has been very good at changing trading partners. So after World War II, when Britain was in decline as empire, they switched to trading closely with the United States. Then in the 70s, after the oil crisis and Japan was rising, they treated Japan as number one. And then Japan went bust. They were looking around in Asia generally for a while, and then they found China. Now we're at a point where, China is where sort of Britain was after World War II, United States after the 70s, or Japan in the early 90s. It's no longer going to be a reliable economic and trading partner for Australia in the long term. We've got to start looking elsewhere. Otherwise, we're going to be caught short when China very soon can no longer afford to buy our stuff.
Let's move on to domestic Australian politics. I put up a tweet of yours talking about the Liberal Party's proposal to ban immigrants from some 13 countries on security grounds, including Egypt, Palestine, and the Philippines. And so I guess this is in response to the rise imposed by the One Nation Party, which is stealing a lot of voters from the right-wing corner of the coalition. So they have to do something in response. But does it create another problem for the moderate Liberals? Because for people living in Sydney and Melbourne, in the metropolitan areas, there are lots of seats the Liberal lost to Teal candidates precisely because many of the voters perceive the Liberals are being too right-wing, too extreme. Isn't the Liberals in a no-win situation here? They're stuck in this no man's land.
I would say that Australian politics need to be careful about not going down the path of Britain and the United States, because what we've seen as a matter of experience with trying to follow that sort of far right ground is that nothing you ever do is ever going to satisfy them, right? So if we take Britain, for example, it started out with the EU, and okay, then they got out of EU. Then it became a refugee issue, and okay, we'll be tougher and follow Australia and stop the boats and so on. Then now you're moving on to legal migrants in the UK and what we're going to do about those. So it just moves from one issue to the next, to the next, to the next. You're never going to satisfy them. I actually recommend, when it comes to the Liberals, that everyone reads a long essay by the former member for Menzies, Keith Woolahan, who wrote a long piece in a publication called Inflection Point.
He lost the election last time, did he?
That's right, he lost.
Yeah.
And he analyzed quite forensically that actually, given the electoral realities in Australia, what the Liberals really need to chase are neither the Teals or One Nation. What they really need to chase are the centrist voters that have gone Labour's way in recent elections. And he especially mentioned aspirational migrants that have broken overwhelmingly in favour of Labour in recent elections.
Especially the Chinese voters.
Yes, Chinese voters, but it's not just Chinese voters, it's also Indian voters and others, right? Those are the voters that the Liberals eventually need to win back, because there are a number of pieces of, I guess, electoral realities at play here, right? So one is that Australia being the most urbanized Western country on earth, the vast majority of Australia's electorates and constituencies are actually in the cities. So if the Liberals can't win in the cities, they're not going to win power. The second thing is we've got a preferential voting system rather than a first past the post voting system. So let's suppose we've got more conservative seats where the final two-party preferred count would be between One Nation and either Liberal or National, right? Even in the most conservative of seats, Labour would typically get 15 to 20% of the vote. And those votes, the preferences would break overwhelmingly in favour of the Liberals and the Nationals against One Nation. Then we move on to the city and the suburban seats. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, although I don't think it's going to break that way, that One Nation almost pretty much replaces the Liberals entirely as the second party to be against Labour when you have two-party preferred counts, okay? What's One Nation's primary vote going to be? Say somewhere in the 30s?
Well,
say they take some of Labour's votes.
Well, the current polling, One Nation's is peaked at about 25%, I think. Yeah.
Okay, but let's give them the most optimistic scenario. All right, that One Nation, they take all of the Liberal votes, and they and they take a little bit of some of the centrist Labour votes, which would take them, say, in primary vote terms, into the 40s. Okay. That's the most optimistic scenario for them in the cities. They have to run a two-party preferred count against Labour on that. City Liberal voters, or what's left of them, if that's the scenario, are not going to break with One Nation. They're going to preference Labour. Most of the other parties are going to preference Labour. So you can have a situation where One Nation might be number one in primary votes, but they'll still lose those seats because. And in a way, it's a little bit like what's been happening with French presidential elections, right?
The runoff, yeah.
So round one, you might have had, Marine Le Pen, or before that, her grandfather Jean-Marie Le Pen doing very well, and then second round, in the runoff, the mainstream left and the mainstream right come together to vote them out. And I think at least in the House of Representatives, that's probably what's going to happen with One Nation. That's not to say, however, that One Nation won't get significant gains in the Senate, but that's a different game altogether.
So I guess let's be thankful for Australia's compulsory voting and preferential voting system, which are one of the better systems in the world. It ensures centrist politics.
It's a bulwark against extremism, let's put it this way. And might I say that the modern preferential voting system in Australia has its origins from a 19th century University of Melbourne mathematician called Nansen. So it was actually not created by political scientists, it was created by a mathematician.
One last question. The ISIS bride question. This is the same question I asked Professor Donald Clark this morning from the USA. The coalition, the Conservative Party, are proposing legislation to actually ban them from returning home or criminalizing anyone who actually try to help them returning home. And the Labour government's position is they will not actively facilitate that return, but they will not be opposed to their return on their own. Say from a purely legal point of view, being a citizen, whether they're ISIS brides or not, they have an inherent right to return home, don't they?
They ought to. And of course, in existing anti-terrorism laws, there are provisions to not allow them to come back for up to 2 years. But that's more on the basis that, you know, you've got situations where people are national security threats, but you need to be able to build a case against them, and you need time to do that, so that as soon as they land back in Australia, if necessary, you can detain them, right? To say that you should have laws permanently banning citizens from coming back, I think we've got to be very careful about that. Again, I go back to this point about be careful what you wish for. It might be that in this particular instance, and I'm not talking about the children here, they're innocent in all of this. It might be that in this particular instance, there are certain number of the adults involved that are people that we would prefer not to have in Australia. It might be that. But if we set a precedent like this on citizens on the basis that we think they are quote unquote undesirable, then that precedent can be used by bad actors who might come to power one day to ban citizens from coming back to Australia for much more frivolous reasons. So we've got to be very careful in situations like this about the precedents we're setting here.
The small c Conservative position should be, if they have committed actual crime, charge them. If they are a national security threat, not passing the threshold of criminal behavior, put them on a watch list, monitoring them for a few years as the law allows, right? The Australian Federal Police can actually survey them for 2 years or more, I presume.
And in fact, you know, again, this is one of the consequences, I guess, of Australia not having a Bill of Rights and so on. And but in fact, depending on how certain mechanisms are designed, there's probably enough case law in Australia to say that you might be able to create a system of preventive detention against people where you have good reason for believing that they're national security threats. So, but obviously it depends on how the system of such detention is designed, but certainly there are loopholes in case law that might allow even for that. You know, and if that's the case, there's probably no need to keep them out of Australia.
Good. I think that covers all the topics we have today. So thanks very much, Kevin, for taking the time. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you.